We understand we have records on Vietnam, on Cuba, the Berlin crisis.
Freedom has many difficulties, and democracy is not perfect. But we have never had to put a wall up to keep our people in.
But after those three incidents, our largest collection of records is on British Guyana. President Kennedy was obsessed with the independence movement in British Guyana and the fear that Cheddi Jagan would come to power in a new independent Guyana, fearing that Cheddi Jagan was going to lead Guyana down the road of a new Cuba or a second Cuba in the Western Hemisphere.
So, at the root of it all was America's long-running hatred of anyone communist, particularly in their own backyard. In 1959, Fidel Castro had taken power in Cuba, and 3 years later, Washington was forced to face down the Soviet Union, which had tried to site nuclear missiles there. And Jagan's attempts at diplomacy were swiftly rebuffed.
Prime Minister Jagan came to the White House in October 1961, and they'd had a long conversation. Prime Minister Jagan thought that conversation had gone very, very well and thought he would soon be receiving economic assistance. After that conversation, President Kennedy decided that the Jagan government had to be overthrown.
Once Kennedy had made his mind up, intense pressure was brought to bear on the British, particularly from 1962 onwards. I have here a copy of a letter written in that year by US Secretary of State Dean Rusk to the British Foreign Secretary Alec Douglas Hume. It sets out the US agenda in no uncertain terms.
I have reached the conclusion that it is not possible for us to put up with an independent British Guyana under Jagan. The continuation of Jagan in power is leading us to disaster in terms of the colony itself, strains on Anglo-American relations, and difficulties for the inter-American system. I hope we can agree that Jagan should not accede to power again. Cordially yours, Dean Rusk.
So, when it came to British Guyana, America's disapproval of colonialism was evidently secondary to its horror of communism. Independence and democracy would have to wait until Marxist Jagan was no longer a threat. After receiving Rusk's letter, Prime Minister Macmillan fired off this angry response to Alec Douglas Hume.
How can the Americans continue to attack us in the United Nations on colonialism, and then use expressions like these, which are not colonialism but pure Machiavellianism?
Douglas Hume then sent a curt letter to US Secretary of State Dean Rusk. In response to his request not to allow Jagan to take power again, he pointedly wrote, "How would you suggest that this can be done in a democracy?" It had little effect. Washington even spelt out who London should support instead: opposition leader Forbes Burnham. Professor Stephen Rabe again.
The underlying issue here is that Forbes Burnham is going to gain power. I have CIA documents in which they say that Cheddi Jagan is far the better choice for Guyana, that he's honest, that he's not a racist, that he'll rule fairly, that he's a parliamentarian, and that Forbes Burnham is a highly dangerous person. Ultimately, all of this advice is rejected because of the fear of Jagan being tied to the international communist movement.
But as 1963 wore on, American pressure on London grew, and the CIA was brought in.
President Kennedy agreed to give a certain amount of economic aid to Prime Minister Jagan, but unknown to Jagan, virtually every economic advisor that came in was a CIA agent. In addition, the United States began to work with the AFL-CIO, the American labor movement, funneling money in through the CIA into the AFL-CIO, and then they were fomenting strikes and demonstrations, which created more and more chaos within British Guyana.
The general strike that by the summer of 1963 had brought British Guyana to its knees had, it seems, been both orchestrated and financed by the CIA.
So it's a kind of long, involved process of internal subversion of the government of Jagan, making it seem almost ungovernable, and thereby getting the Macmillan government to agree to the U.S. perception. Now, there's enormous resistance to this by the Colonial Office in particular. Gradually, the Foreign Office will come to the conclusion that good relations with the United States are more important than the future of British Guyana.
So in other words, to uphold democracy and avoid the possibility of countries going communist, it may be necessary to destroy democracy.
That was the policy pursued, although no one would ever quite admit it to themselves.
It was the personal intervention of President John F. Kennedy himself that finally sealed British Guyana's fate. On June the 30th, 1963, Kennedy arrived at Birch Grove, Macmillan's country estate.
He basically issues an ultimatum to Prime Minister Macmillan in which he basically says that if British Guiana achieves its independence under Cheddi Jagan, that'll become a major political issue in the United States. President Kennedy will be defeated. There'll be new fears of nuclear confrontation in the world. And surely, Prime Minister Macmillan, you don't want that to happen. And then one must remember that, at least from the Prime Minister's perspective and the Foreign Office's perspective, British Guiana is a problem. They would like simply to get rid of it. It's not an important colony. It's rife with chaos and dissension. We have to get out of this situation.
So the combination of American pressure and its own self-interest convinces the British to cooperate. A decade earlier, Britain had sent in the gunboats. But with such colonial-style tactics ruled out this time, what would Macmillan do now?
Prime Minister Macmillan at the end of September again writes back and says, all right, we're going to have a conference and Colonial Secretary Sands will impose a solution. And this is what we think will happen. We'll present the idea of proportional representation. Prime Minister Jagan will quickly decide that this is a way of depriving the Indo-Guyanese majority of power. There'll be a deadlock and I'll impose a solution. So it's pretty much arriving at Lancaster. It's a pre-cooked solution.
A month later, Duncan Sands was ready to put his plan, outlined in our document, into action. Dr Spencer Morby.
This is Lancaster House, where the Colonial Office officials, the Colonial Secretary Duncan Sands, the head of the People's Progressive Party, Cheddi Jagan, the head of the PNC, Forbes Burnham, gathered in October 1963 in an attempt to resolve the disagreements which were ongoing in British Guyana.
And it's quite a setting, isn't it? It's a gloriously luxurious room, about 100 metres long by about 30 wide. It was obviously an important building for a very important occasion.
Inside the imposing surroundings of Lancaster House, Dr Morby and I read through Duncan Sands' document.
So what we have here is a record of a meeting in the Colonial Secretary's room on the 7th of October 1963. And the third point that they mention is fairly explicit. It states, "It was important to ensure, both at the conference and in the meantime, that Dr Jagan and Mr Burnham failed to agree either on the terms of reference or on the composition of any good officers' commission." The idea that the conference would fail had been suspected for some time, but this document proves that the British are actively engaged in making sure, in guaranteeing, if you like, that it does fail, and that Burnham is encouraged not to compromise in any sense with Jagan during the course of the conference.
With no agreement between the parties, thanks to help from Britain, the door was open for Sands to step in with his own solution. This consisted of dismissing all further talks between the country's political leaders as a waste of time, and in a selfless move to prevent further delays for independence, Britain would decide their country's future for them. Sands then drafted a letter for the three leaders, which each would be invited to sign. Fearing that Dr Jagan's team might get suspicious and advise their leader to reject the idea, Duncan Sands made an unusual request. Professor Clem Seacharin.
On the fatal day, Duncan Sands, the Colonial Secretary, phoned Cheddi Jagan and said, "I want you to come, and I want you to come alone. I don't want you to bring any of your advisors." But Burnham and Peter de Gaar, the leader of the United Force, they were all there with their advisors.
According to Professor Seacharin, things couldn't have gone better for Sands. When the men arrived at the meeting to find the letter laid out on the table, Jagan was the first to sign.
Bereft of legal advice, he didn't understand the implications of what he was signing. He signed it was virtually kind of a blank check. It gave the British a free ride now, that they could subvert him without having to suspend the Constitution. He was handing over power to adjudicate on all the contentious issues to one man, Duncan Sands, who was determined to get rid of him.